in 1847, and he died in West Orange, New Jersey in 1931 at the age of 84. And he came to Fort Myers in the winter of 1884-85 to recuperate from an illness. And he kind of liked it here, so he bought 14 acres of land. Now, Edison was interested in the plants and the trees for their products and their byproducts. So the garden we go through is a botanical garden. It is not a landscape garden. And we have well over 300 species of plants here in the garden. We're not going to talk about all of them today, but we will try to point out some of the interesting ones as we go along on our walk. Now, as we go along on this walk, we do ask that you abide by a few rules and regulations. We do ask that you remain on the walks at all times. We ask that you do not pick up any of the foliage along the walks. For 10% of our plants and trees are poisonous in one way or another. And if you wish to smoke, please smoke while we're out on the walks. Do not smoke when we get up around or in any of the buildings. And if you wish to take pictures, feel free to take them at any time. But do try to stay up with our group. Now, the first tree I'd like to call your attention to is the one you walked under here when you came out of the ticket office, which is an African sausage tree. And if you look off on your right-hand side or left-hand side over here, you'll notice the big sausages hanging there in the tree. Or if you can't spot them, there are several here on the ground. Now, the interesting thing about this tree is the fact it's a night-blooming tree, normally pollinated by African bats. And we don't have many African bats here in South Florida, so we have to send a gardener up each year, and they hand-pollinate the tree. Now, the sausage will grow to weigh between 8 and 15 pounds. It has only two good reasons for being in existence. Number one, it's a seed pod for the tree, so it'll grow more sausage trees. And number two, it's a great conversation piece. Outside of that, it has very little use at all. And then off on your left-hand side, you might notice the gardenia trees there, and there are several of those. And as you come down the walk, look off here on your right-hand side, you'll notice our two mango trees back here. Now, the mango produces a very edible fruit. But if you have not eaten a mango, you may want to take it in small doses when you start out. For many people are very allergic to mangoes. Also, if somebody suggests you climb up and pick your own mango, be particularly careful, because the mango is in the poison ivy family, and you may end up with a very bad rash. Park tree here on your right-hand side is an ear tree. It's another South American tree that gets its name from the seed pod. And there are lots of ears up there on the tree, but they're so far away it's hard to see them. And I have one here in my hand, and you can see how it does have the configuration of a good ear. Looks very, very much like a good ear. Doesn't hear very well, but it looks pretty good. And that's the seed pod off an ear tree. Mr. Edison was responsible for the first 2 miles of the raw palms being planted. Now, he imported them from Cuba, even though they grew wild down in Big Cypress Swamp. In 1900, it was cheaper to get them from Cuba than it was to get them out of that swamp. Since that time, interested citizens, the city and the county, have continued to plant raw palms until we now have about 14 miles of it going out toward the beach. And of course, it's because of those stately royal palms that the city gets the nickname, the City of Palms. Now, when Edison beautified the first 2 miles out here, it was nothing more than a cow path going through his property. The little palms here on each side of the gateway as we go out to go across the street are areca palms, and the areca palms came from Madagascar. Now, as you go out to go across the street, as soon as you go through the gateway here, look right straight across, and you'll notice our yellow blossom. As you go in the gate on the other side, look above, and you'll notice a pink blossom. So watch the yellow blossoms, the pink blossoms, and the cars as we go across the street. Trees here on the right-hand side of the walk. Don't go too far beyond the second tree there. Blossom that's off here on our right-hand side, and that is on a little dwarf poinsettia tree back there. And then the pink blossom right above your head. There's some yellow ones over on the other side. There's some white ones up here and white ones ahead of us there. These are all frangipani or plumeria. And if you had gone to Hawaii instead of coming to Florida, they'd have picked the blossom off the frangipani and made those beautiful leis for you. Right behind the frangipani here on your right-hand side, we have a citrus growing. Today it looks like it's about the size of a grapefruit. But it'll continue to grow until it's about twice that size, and it's a nice ponderosa lemon. So it'll grow up to be a pretty good size of lemon. The next citrus here on your right-hand side is a Florida sweet orange, and most of you are familiar with that because of Florida orange juice. But the next one here is for the sour orange. Because many people say, why bother with the sour orange? But they use the sour orange to make your orange marmalade out of. So if you like orange marmalade, you like to have a few sour oranges around. They also use the root stock of the sour orange to propagate the sweet orange. Right in the corner on your left-hand side, there's a little tiny plant with just some brand new blossoms on it, and that is a caterpillar plant. Well, officially, they call it a chenille plant. The chenille plant came from the Bismarck Islands. But chenille is caterpillar in French, so it all amounts to the same thing. On your right-hand side, we have a pink powder puff with lots of blossoms on the pink powder puff. Then we have Dick walking by. Right behind Dick, you'll notice that nice vine growing there, which is a golden chalice vine. And the golden chalice vine came from Mexico. If you look right behind the golden chalice vine, you'll notice that tall palm tree there. And around that palm tree, there are little circles. And out of those circles, long needles are growing. And that is a needle palm, and the needle palm came from Cuba. Before the invention of the steel needle, they picked the needles off that needle palm to sew their sails with. As you come around the corner here, if you look way up toward the sky, you'll notice the bougainvillea vine growing up there on that punk paper tree. Now, as you look up there, you may think you're looking at the flower, but really what you're looking at is the breadth of the plant. In other words, it's the leaves that turn colored. The flower is nothing more than a little white dot inside of those colored leaves. And then here on your left-hand side, we have a few more gardenia here on our Cape jasmine bush. Off on your left-hand side, it's hard to pick out, but there's some blossoms up here on this angel trumpet tree. They've kind of wilted today, but the angel trumpet is part of our narcotic family, for the blossom produces atropine. And then on your right-hand side here, we have a cowhorn orchid. Now, the cowhorn orchid here is a part of our floral endangered species. Off on your left-hand side, you'll notice the big bed of greenery there and a few blossoms up on it, and that is a shell ginger plant. And the shell ginger came from Asia. On your right-hand side, the blossoms you see here are on the Java glory flower. And then you're going to come by a copper-tone tree here, or a copper-tone bush. And actually it's referred to as Joseph's coat many times because of the multicolored leaves. And alongside of that, there's a bullhorn acacia. And as you come by, notice the thorns on the trunk of the tree, and you'll understand why they call that the bullhorn. On your left-hand side, there are a few blossoms left here on our bird's eye bush from South Africa. And then the next bush on your left-hand side has a few blossoms on is a fringed hibiscus. If you notice the beehives back here, these are Holland beehives. Mr. Edison imported bees from Holland to help with the pollination of the plant. And then he got very interested in beeswax. For you may recall, he used the beeswax in the manufacture of his early phonograph records. He's also credited with the invention of wax paper, and he used the beeswax when he invented wax paper. The ponytail palm here on your left-hand side is a misnomer. The ponytail palm belongs to the lily family. It does not belong to the palm family. This large tree you're going to walk under here is a lychee nut tree that came from China. Now, the lychee nut produces a very edible nut. When it's ready to be eaten, it looks like a strawberry on the outside. You open it up, and on the inside, it looks like a grape. You taste it, it tastes just like a lychee nut. On your left, at the end of the walk here, we have some bamboo. Now, one of the things that attracted Mr. Edison to this area was this large stand of green giant bamboo that grew here along the river. Now, the reason he got interested in bamboo, you may recall Mr. Edison invented his light bulb in 1879. And he used a little cotton thread for the filament of that early light bulb. And it didn't work very well. He soon found that bamboo made a much better filament for light bulbs than cotton thread. So he went on a worldwide search to find the very best bamboo for making filaments for light bulbs. Unfortunately, the green giant did not stand up. So the only interesting thing I can tell you about green giant bamboo is the rapidity with which it will grow. And it'll grow anywhere from 12 to 14 inches a day during the growing season. And then it'll grow to be anywhere from 35 to 65 feet tall, and it just quits growing and doesn't grow any more after that at all. To the left of the bamboo, we have a ladyfinger firecracker plant. It's about a month ahead of time as far as blossoming is concerned. So we do have the little ladyfinger firecracker. Now, on the site of this gray building here originally stood Mr. Edison's light lab, and he did some of the research on his light bulb here in Fort Myers. But in 1925, Henry Ford, his next-door neighbor, talked him out of that building. They disassembled it, took it up to Dearborn, Michigan, and reassembled it at Greenfield Village. So now, in order for you to see where he did the research on the light bulb here in Fort Myers, you have to go up to Michigan in order to do that. Mrs. Edison realized he missed that building, so she built this building to take its place. But this never became a successful building. All this ever was a puttering spot for Mr. Edison on rainy days. So it really will not take you too long to go through the building. Really what you want to see is in the back of the building. And in the back of the building is a bust of the second Mrs. Edison. Now, Edison was married twice. His first wife died at an early age, and they had 3 children. Those children are all deceased, and they did not have any children. From the second marriage, there also were 3 children. Theodore is living in West Orange, New Jersey, 88 years of age, but he does not have any children. Madeline, the daughter, married a Sloan. She is deceased, but she had 4 children. And Charles is deceased, and Charles did not have any children. So as soon as Theodore passes away is the end of that Edison line. Now, as you hurry through to see the bust in the back of the garden, take time to look back at the fireplace chimney, and you'll notice a queen's wreath growing up on the fireplace chimney. And then as you come out on the other side, as soon as you come through the little archway there, look right above your head, and you'll notice the blossom on the white bird of paradise. Now, I know it looks like a banana plant, but take a look at that blossom up there, and then you'll see the white bird of paradise. So you hurry through. I'll meet you as you come out on the other side, and we'll go down to the spice garden. White bird of paradise looks like a banana plant. That's not too unusual, for it's in the banana family, and it's a very close relative. The yellow house off on your right-hand side was a honeymoon cottage for the second Mrs. Edison, and it's now occupied by our caretaker. This large palm on the left-hand side of the walk is a lantana palm. It grows very profusely all through the tropical area. And they tell me that one is 70 years of age. The next tree on your left-hand side is a cinnamon tree. If you look right behind the cinnamon tree, you'll see a stand of black bamboo that came from Asia. But the black bamboo did not make very good filaments for light bulbs either. The next tree here on your left-hand side is a calabash tree from the West Indies. Now, the calabash tree is often referred to as our Jimmy Durante tree. For you may recall, he always signed his program off, "Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are." And here she was in Fort Myers all the time. On your right-hand side, we have some common tea plants that came from China. And then the next big tree you're going to walk under here is a clove tree. And it's a blossom of the clove tree that they dry that you use in your cooking. Next to that, we have an allspice tree, and allspice is a spice in its own right. It is not a mixture of spices, as many people think. At the end of the walk, we have a bay tree from which you get your bay leaves. And around the bay tree, we have some croton plants growing. And we have many varieties of croton plants here in the garden. And it's from the croton plants that they get the medicinal oil that is called croton oil. Somewhere along the line, you may have used an art gum eraser. And if you've ever used an art gum eraser, you might be interested in the vine growing back there on the cistern. And there's some blossoms right up on the top of it. And that is an orchid vine, and it produces the type of latex that's used in making those art gum erasers. Looks cleaner every hour on the hour. Or every hour and a quarter on the hour and a quarter. Now, Mr. Edison did not believe in exercise. He believed that the body was made to carry the brain around. And you only use 10% of the brain, so why bother exercising the body? But he did build a swimming pool here for his children and his guests. Now, the swimming pool was built in 1900 with Edison Portland cement. And Mr. Edison had his own Portland cement factory up in New Village, New Jersey. And that factory was producing 1,000 barrels a day. And finally, they were using that cement to build the Panama Canal and the original Yankee Stadium. And as they were producing that 1,000 barrels a day, they had a fire in the barrel division, and they burned it to the ground. And Edison debated as far as rebuilding. He finally said there's a better way of distributing cement. So he weighed 1 cubic foot of cement, and he found that it weighed 94 pounds. He then had sacks made that would hold 94 pounds of cement and started selling it by the sack. And if you went out today to buy a sack of cement, you would buy 94 pounds in your sack of cement. Now, the difference between the Panama Canal and the Yankee Stadium and this swimming pool is the canal and the stadium are reinforced with reinforcing steel. The swimming pool here is reinforced with bamboo. And except during the periods they're cleaning it, it has held water since 1900. Now, when we put water in the pool, it comes from an artesian well. It's about 1,100 feet deep, and it develops about 30 pounds of pressure. Back in Mr. Edison's day, he had a nice naturally circulating pool, where he would let the artesian well water run, and we'd come in down at the deep end, go out here at the shallow end, end up in a little lily pond down below. But of course, nowadays, since you can't afford to waste that much water, we've had to cut down on the flow of Mr. Edison's swimming pool. And the reason that it's empty at the present time and they're cleaning it, we now grow algae and tadpoles in Mr. Edison's swimming pool. So about twice a year they have to dump it out and start over again, or else it would be just too filthy to come by. Now as we go down the walk here, be careful of the hose across the walk so you don't stumble as you come by. And then off on your left-hand side, notice our big bed of greenery here and all the blossoms on it. But if you're interested in this bed of greenery, you're really not interested in the blossom. For that is commercial ginger, and that's the one you get your ginger root from. On your right-hand side, we have a weeping willow tree that came from China. Alongside of that, we have pampas grass that came from South America. And then along the pond here, we have papyrus that came from Egypt. Now, papyrus is referred to as the bulrushes in the Bible. It was also used in the manufacture of paper in those early years. And then you might notice the coconut tree there, and all of them off here on this side of the walkway. This is about as far north as good coconuts will grow. And it takes about 3 years from the time you get the blossom on the coconut tree until you finally get the ripened fruit. If you look all the way at the end of the lily pond, you'll notice the Ixora hedge that's beginning to bloom back there. Mr. and Mrs. Edison had a little problem. Mrs. Edison loved birds, Mr. Edison loved cats. And the cats and the birds didn't always get along well together. So he solved that problem by building all the birdhouses out into the water so that the cats couldn't get to the birds. Now, Florida is one of your large producers of sugar, and all of that nice sweet sugar comes from scraggly old sugar cane like you see growing here on the right-hand side of the walk. The body of water out here is the Caloosahatchee River, named after the Calusa Indians. Hatchee is river in Indian, so it gets that good name, Caloosahatchee. Mr. Edison built that pier out there about a half a mile into the river so the schooners of his day could get in and tie up there. And then he put the little veranda on the end of the pier in order to do his fishing. He had kind of an interesting theory about fishing. For he said if he went out there with his fishing pole, no one would disturb him, because you do not talk to a fisherman. He also did not want the fish bothering him, so he never put a hook on the end of the line. So he had lots of time to meditate as he fished off the end of the pier. The big tree on your right-hand side is an Indian rubber tree. Member of the ficus family, a latex-producing tree from which you can make rubber. Before you make the turn at the end of the walk here, if you look right straight ahead, you'll see a little box of aloe plant. And the aloe plant came from Africa. And it's a good one to have around, for if you get a bad burn, you rub the juice of the aloe on and it'll take the burn away. And it's used as a base for many of our suntan oils. As you come up the walk, on your left-hand side, notice the first two plants here, especially the one with the big seed pod on it, and then all of these off here on your right-hand side. Now, these are all cycad plants, and they believe the cycad plants are the earliest seed-bearing plants known to man. They also feel that the cycad plants are food for the dinosaur. For many times when they find the fossilized remains of a dinosaur, they'll find the fossilized prints of those cycad leaves. The first tree on your right-hand side is a little staghorn fern growing on it. Now, staghorn ferns, bromeliads, orchids, Spanish moss are all air plants. They get all of their nourishment from the wind and the rain. They take nothing away from the tree they fasten themselves to. The next tree here on your right-hand side is a cabbage palm or sable palm. And the cabbage palm is our Florida state tree. On the left-hand side of the walk, right at the end here, we have a plant many of you are very familiar with. The snake plant, Sansevieria, mother-in-law's tongue, call it what you will. But in the early years, they used the fibers from the mother-in-law's tongue to make hemp rope. As you come around the corner here on your left-hand side, notice our little palm tree here. Be sure you notice the trunk of the palm, for it's from the trunk that it gets its name, the bearded palm. And the bearded palm came from Cuba. And as you come up the walk on your left-hand side, you'll notice the bird cage with a couple of lovebirds in it, and then you'll notice a lot of blossoms on the ground, and those are off of our sausage tree there. And those are blossoms that have not been pollinated. Now, Mr. Edison drew up the plans for these houses we're going to view. He sent them to a friend in Fairfield, Maine. The houses were actually constructed in Fairfield, Maine. They were then disassembled, put on 4 schooners, and shipped here to Fort Myers. Unloaded down at the pier, brought up here and reassembled. So what you're going to be looking at is some of the earliest prefabricated houses we know anything about here in Fort Myers. Now, as we view the house, on the left-hand side will be the master bedroom. And there are 2 doors into the master bedroom. There's one on each side of the stairway up here. So don't all gather at the first door. Some go around look in from the second door. And then when you finish looking into the master bedroom, if you look out at the porch on the other side, there's still a few blossoms left on the magnolia tree. So you can see the blossoms on the magnolia after you've looked into the master bedroom. Above the master bedroom, there's another bedroom that's dubbed Mr. Edison's dog house. And when we get over in the museum, I'll point out one time Mrs. Edison had good reason to put him up in that dog house. Also, as you look into the house, be sure you notice the furnishing. For Mrs. Edison left this property to the city of Fort Myers in 1947, about 6 months before she passed away, providing they would keep it as a perpetual memorial to her husband. So all of the furnishings in the house are as she left them in 1947. And finally, as you look into the house, be sure you notice the chandeliers. For the chandeliers are all handcrafted, and the light bulbs in those chandeliers have been burning since 1925. They now burn about 10 hours a day. Now, why do they burn so long? When you look in, you'll notice they're not very bright bulbs. They're less than 7 watts. Number 2, they're a very heavy tungsten filament bulb. And they tell me it takes a lot more electricity to run the heavy tungsten filament bulb than it does to run your modern bulb. So you're probably much happier changing bulbs more often, so you get a much brighter light for a lot less money. Then as you come up on the porch, the plants here on your left-hand side are cobra lilies. Cobra lilies.
Well, you've moved since I was here last. Here, so I can sit in and buy you a paintbrush that's wider than that one? Oh, that's the one you need to get between the little cracks. Oh, man.
Glad I'm not a painter. I'd use a big one and do it in a hurry. Now, we have only one door in the main house here that you will not be able to see all the way through the house from. And that'll be the first door on the right-hand side as you go up the veranda here. Now, originally, that was Mr. Edison's telegraph office. And in later years, Mrs. Edison decided she wanted a downstairs bathroom. So they remodeled this house. They put in the downstairs bathroom. And when they did that, they changed Mr. Edison's telegraph office into, of all things, a outer room for the ladies. And before you leave the porch, if you look off on your left-hand side, you'll notice our royal ponciana tree is just beginning to bloom out there. And then you might also notice the red bougainvillea here at the end of the porch. Now, I mentioned Mrs. Edison was the one interested in the birds. She asked the gardeners if they'd bring any injured birds they found on the property to her. If she could nurse them back to life, she'd have them mounted and displayed in the case here at the end of the porch. And that large egg in the front of the case is an eagle's egg. Now, if you had drawn up the plans for this house, what rooms would you have added that apparently Mr. Edison left out? Did you miss anything in there? No kitchen and no dining room. Now, I mentioned Mr. Edison came by schooner, and his guests also came by schooner. And it's reported the schooners only came in every 30 days. So if his guests were not back on that schooner at night, they were here for 30 days. Now, Edison said they'd get along a lot better. He lived in one house, and they lived in another house. So we have the main house, and we have the guest house. Now, it's also reported Mr. Edison did not like the smell of cooking food. So he put the kitchen over in the guest house. Now, he put the dining room over there for two reasons. Number one, it was closer to the kitchen. And number two, his theory was, if he had the dining room here in his house, he would become the host. He'd have to stay at the table until all of the guests excused themselves. But if he put the dining room over in the guest house, then when he went over there for meals, he became a guest in the guest house. As soon as the meal was over, he could excuse himself and go on and do whatever he wanted to do. So you see, he had it pretty well figured out how you get along with your guests when they're going to stay for 30 days. Now, do watch your step as you come down to go across to the guest house, but you may notice the Rangoon creeper right here alongside of the porch, and you'll notice it has both pink and red blossoms on it here at the same time. The Rangoon creeper. Now, Mr. Edison did put a hook on the end of the line when he fished off his electric launch, the Reliance. And one day they were out with a fishing party, and Charles had a guest with him. And Charles and his guests just kept tearing around on the deck disturbing the fishing. Now, those boys were about 12 years of age. Finally, Mrs. Edison said, if we're ever going to catch fish, we got to quiet these boys down. Now, they thought of several ways of doing that. But they ended up by putting the boys in the dinghy and towing them along behind. And things quieted down very rapidly. Then Mr. Edison caught his first carp, and he said, that's lovely, I'm going to have it mounted. But about an hour later, Mrs. Edison caught the next one you're going to see, and he said, well, now yours is a little nicer. Let's mount yours and forget about mine. But at the end of the day, son Charles came along with the one you're going to see around the corner here. And he said, oh my goodness, we've got to mount Charles's. We'll just forget about the other two. But Charles said, Dad, this is the first time I beat you in anything. Will you please mount them all so I have permanent proof of it? And as you go around the corner here, you'll understand why Charles wanted all of the carpet mounted. Now, as you look into the dining room, be sure you visualize Mr. Edison having a meal there with some very important people. For both President Harding and President Hoover had meals here at the dining room table with Mr. Edison. Now, as we go around the corner here, the kitchen and the butler's pantry will be on our right-hand side. As you look into the butler's pantry, be sure you notice the double compartment sink. For we feel it's one of the first ones ever constructed. And it looks very much like it's stainless steel. But actually it's a copper base with a nickel coating. Alongside of it, there's a brass item called the samovar. And that samovar was a gift to Mr. Edison by Tsar Nicholas of Russia. And then when you come right to the end of the porch here, if you look right straight ahead here, you're going to notice a big old gumbo limbo tree out there. Now that gumbo limbo tree is often referred to as our tourist tree. For I'm sure when you look out there, you're going to notice that it's always red and it's always healing, just like many of our tourists. It takes a little while to get everybody out of the kitchen. While you're all coming out of the kitchen, we'll find out where some of you folks are visiting us from. Where are you folks visiting us from?
Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Kalamazoo. Yeah, I have some friends who live up northward Meyers who are from Kalamazoo. Where are you from? Baltimore.
We've also been from Ohio.
Ohio. Oh, from Greenfield Village. Georgia. Where are you folks back here from? Orlando. That's Florida. Where are you from? Texas. Topeka. Where are you folks back here from? Boynton Beach. Where are you from? Baltimore. Florida. Orlando. Wisconsin. Milwaukee. You read the Milwaukee Sentinel? No, my brother-in-law's going to hate you. My brother-in-law is the editor of the Milwaukee Sentinel. You better switch over and start reading the Sentinel. Where are you folks from? Newport Richey, Florida. St. Pete, Florida. Where are you folks over here from? Germany. You make us an international tour today. Where are you folks coming down the stairs visiting us from? Wyoming. Maryland. You're from Florida but living in Albuquerque. Which is best? Oh, there. She belongs to the Chamber of Commerce, I'll bet you. Where are you folks from? Tampa. Now, notice this big tree right at the end of the walkway here. That's a staculiolata tree that came from India. And until 1960, it had the distinction of being the tallest tree in the state of Florida. But in 1960, the Hurricane Donna came through here with winds up to 123 miles an hour. Took the top out of that tree, reduced it in stature, so it has absolutely no claim to fame today at all. Nothing more than a staculiolata tree that came from India. The purple blossom on your right-hand side there is a Thumbergia. Now, I mentioned Mr. Edison's next-door neighbor, Henry Ford, talked him out of that light lab. And the gray house right behind the Morton Bay fig tree here was the winter home for Henry Ford. And they say Mr. Ford did some of the research on his V8 engine back in the gray house over there. Now, the Morton Bay fig tree here is kind of interesting, for after World War I, Mr. Edison said if we ever had another war, the United States rubber supply would be cut off, and we'd have no source of rubber here in the United States. So Ford, Firestone, and Edison went together, formed a corporation to find rubber in the United States. Now, Ford and Firestone encouraged Edison to import a lot of those ficus trees and plant big plantations of them. But Mr. Edison said that it'd take too long, 20 to 25 years, just waiting for the trees to mature. So he started doing research on native plants. And after researching about 15,000 plants, he discovered the little goldenrod plant produced the best latex for making rubber. So Edison went into the production of goldenrod rubber. Now, at the same time, over in Germany, they were doing research on a petroleum-based synthetic rubber. And, of course, back in 1925 and 29, lots of petroleum, very cheap, and they could put it on the market cheaper than he could put goldenrod rubber on the market. But it's interesting to note, with the way our petroleum prices were going there for a while, that the University of Arizona again started doing research on goldenrod rubber. And someday in the future, we may ride on goldenrod rubber tires as Mr. Edison did back in 1927 and 28. Now, I did mention some of our plants were poisonous in one way or another. As you come up the walk, notice our little physic nut tree here on the right-hand side. Came from the West Indies. And they tell me if you eat one of the nuts off of that tree, it's equivalent to a whole box of X-Lax. Morning, Hugh. Now, as you come to walk here on your right-hand side, notice our little Natal orange tree, and the Natal orange came from Africa. Now, the Natal orange is a part of that poison family. For from the Natal orange, they make the poison we call strychnine. Then on your left-hand side, we have a big old camphor tree here, and that's the one you get your camphor oil from. And we have many bromeliads growing on it here. And then on your right-hand side, you'll notice this nice yangling tree as you come by. Now, Mr. Edison planted the yangling for the ladies. For the yangling tree from Indonesia is a base for many of your exotic perfumes. I mentioned Mr. Edison went on a worldwide search to find the very best bamboo for making filaments for light bulbs. The little bamboo off on your left-hand side here turned out to be the very best, and it came from Japan. Mr. Edison had enough coffee plants on the grounds to supply his own needs, and all these plants off on the left-hand side of Friendship Walk are coffee plants. Now, Mrs. Edison did not keep a guest log in her house. She asked her guests if they would bring a stone with her name engraved on it that they could put here in Friendship Walk. And all of a sudden they realized there was no stone here in Friendship Walk from their next-door neighbor over there, Henry Ford. So one night Mr. Edison said to Henry, because they were such good friends, "Wouldn't you like to contribute a stone to Friendship Walk?" And Henry said, "Of course I would." He went over to his gray house, he went out into the garden, he dug up a stone and brought it over and handed it to Mr. Edison. Edison took it, he looked at it, he said, "Henry, it doesn't have your name engraved on it." And Henry said, "I can't afford to do that." So the third stone here on the left-hand side is the blank stone that poor Henry Ford contributed to Friendship Walk. Come up the walk on your right-hand side, notice our little pineapple garden here, and you'll see some new pineapple coming along. Now, the interesting thing about the pineapple, as soon as they begin to ripen up, the raccoons will be over and eat all of our pineapple. The big Zulu fig tree on your right-hand side is a member of the ficus family, another latex-producing tree from which you can make rubber. And on your left-hand side, notice this tall fern growing up here, which is an Australian tree fern. As you come down the walk on your left-hand side, look back here and notice our big leaf sea grape. And you'll have no trouble spotting it because of the size of those leaves. And those leaves will grow to be anywhere from 24 to 42 inches across. And it's from the big leaf sea grape they get the pectin that is used as far as firming up jelly when jelly is made. Off on your right-hand side, notice the bromeliad back here. It looks like it has a bunch of pink ribbons tied on it. That's the petal on the Princess bromeliad. And then if you look back a little bit after you come by the big staghorn fern there, you'll see the orange one back there. And then on your left-hand side, notice that tall African oil palm. Now, the oil from the oil palm has a couple of very good uses. It's used to make a very good cooking oil, and it's also used to make a very good soap. Now, Edison planted the yangling for you ladies, but he did not forget his children. And for his children, he chose to plant a sapodilla tree that came from Central America. Anybody familiar enough with sapodillas from Central America to know why he planted that just for his children? From the sapodilla tree, you get chicle. From chicle, you make chewing gum. So that was the children's chewing gum tree, planted back there. As you come around the corner, notice the little roses here on each side of the walkway. These are Spanish roses, very popular here in South Florida for their ever blooming. And then you might also notice the orchid up here on the trunk of the tree, and the big blossoms there coming out of that lovely orchid. Back across the street, I'll be in the back of the group for a few minutes, but I'll turn the light after you're all safely across the street. So as you go through the gate on the other side, walk up toward the banyan tree. As you approach the banyan tree, stay on the cement walk on the left-hand side. Do not go up on the wooden walk, but stay on the cement walk on the left-hand side. Continue to walk until you come to where the root is growing right in the middle of the walk. And we'll gather around that root and continue our tour from there. Now, if that tour ahead of us is still gathered around the root, just stop 10 or 15 feet short of them. The banyan tree we're now standing and walking under is reported to be the third largest banyan tree in the world. The largest banyan tree is located in Calcutta, India. Now, it's reported to be over 1,000 years of age, and it covers over 10 acres of land. Now, we just walked around 5 acres on the other side over there, so you can visualize how large that tree must be. The second largest banyan tree is located in the Hawaiian Islands, on the island of Maui, at the city of Lahaina. Now, this is a slip of the Calcutta tree. When Mr. Firestone was there in 1925, he said, "That's an interesting tree, Mr. Edison, and I'd love to have one." So he sent a slip over here, and when it arrived here, it was 2 inches in diameter, it was 4 feet tall, and it was growing in a buttercup. They planted it out here, and 61 years later, you see what resulted from the planting of that tree. Now, it's interesting to note, for the first 25 years, this tree grew as any other tree. One trunk going up, branches coming down, and first 25 years, it grew up, one trunk, branches coming down, but at the end of that 25 years, those branches started to sag more than normal. And then the bark would break, and all these hair roots would start coming down. And you see new hair roots coming down all the way around us, even today. Now, when a hair root reaches the ground, it has 2 responsibilities. First is to make a support for the branch from which it came. And secondly is to take nourishment. And if you notice the root right here in the middle of the walk, which was let down about 21 years ago, first it made a support for this very narrow branch here. But then it started taking nourishment, and look how much healthier it is over on this side of the root than it is back on that side, which would indicate that it never feeds anything back to the mother tree. It always feeds away from the mother tree. So this gets nicknamed the walking tree. And this tree would have walked much farther than it has, but they keep trimming it back each year so that it doesn't take over the whole garden here. Now, as we get our turn to go into the lab here, I'm going to have to collect your punch tickets. So while you're digging out your punch tickets, let me tell you a couple things about Mr. Edison. Now, Mr. Edison was deaf. And the theory is that he used about 11. He delivered papers on a train between Fort Huron and Detroit, Michigan. And he was late one day, and that train had already started to pull out from the station. So he ran out, threw his papers up on the train, and then he tried to climb aboard. And he was not doing very well. Unfortunately, a conductor came along at that time. The conductor saw the problem, reached out, grabbed him by the head, and pulled him up on the train. And they say it's when he grabbed him by the head that it collapsed the eardrums, and Mr. Edison was not able to hear after that. Now, it's also reported Mr. Edison was not very well educated by our standards. Now, he was sent to school, but he only went about 3 months. At the end of the 3 months, his teacher sent him home with a note that said he was adult and would never learn anything, and it was a waste of time to send him back to school. So he never went back to school. But fortunately, his mother had been trained to be a teacher. She taught him how to read, and once he learned how to read, he became a prolific reader. And he read everything he could get his hands on. And he had that tremendous power of retention and recall. So anything that he read, he could recall it many years later and put it to good use. So in spite of the fact that he was not very well educated by our standards, he must have been a very well self-educated individual. For in his lifetime, he received 1,097 patents, the largest number of patents ever issued to any individual. Probably many of you thought in terms of a little plant that grows along the highway with a yellow head on it that they say gives you hay fever. And that's what Mr. Edison started out with. But once he started cultivating goldenrod, he cultivated it to grow almost 12 foot tall. And it took 100 pounds of the 12-foot tall goldenrod to make 1 pound of latex for making rubber. Now, Edison made a pretty fair rubber, for if you left your modern rubber out for 50 years without any protection at all, it would lose its resiliency and have no bounce. But we have a sample of his goldenrod rubber here, and I'm going to drop it here on the corner of the desk, and you'll notice it'll bounce without any trouble at all. So he made a pretty fair rubber when he made it. Now, many people like to say they had a hold of goldenrod rubber, and we'll give you that opportunity if you so desire. The only thing we ask is that the last person who gets it, if they'll make sure it gets back up here on the desk, so the next tour can have the same opportunity. Now, you have all heard stories of Mr. Edison taking naps on his desk or his bench, and he used to sleep on the desk here. But in later years, Mrs. Edison got concerned about him falling off and hurting himself, so she brought the little cot over so he'd have the cot to take those cat naps on. Now, of that 1,097 patents Mr. Edison received, 386 of them had to deal with electricity. The rest had to deal with a multitude of things, and here's one of his early efforts in the motion picture industry. Mr. Edison made the Bell telephone usable. Until he came along, you had to shout into the phone in order to be heard. But he invented the little carbon disc. It goes into the mouthpiece and receiver, hooked it up with a magneto, and then all you had to do was talk into the phone, and you could be heard without any trouble at all. Edison has many patents on the improvement of the typewriter. In fact, it was one of his patents that made it possible for them to type faster than they could write longhand. Now, when he came out with this flat disc phonograph, he was not able to interpret what was going on the phonograph because of his deafness. So he compensated for that by building a wooden frame around the phonograph to pick up the vibrations. Then he clamped his teeth down here on the corner of the frame, and you can see the teeth marks here where he clamped down on it. He picked up the vibrations through his teeth. He said the nerve endings were by the middle ear, and therefore he could interpret what was going on the phonograph by listening through his teeth. Now, if you had come 2.5 to 3 years ago, you would not have been able to go through this lab. For Mr. Edison had a theory that it was a waste of time to label a jar if you already knew what was in it. And he had many jars of chemicals back there without labels on them because he knew what was in them. But our EPA came along and said they didn't know what was in them, so they closed this lab for about 6 months, analyzed all of those chemicals, and finally decided it's very safe for us to go through. So don't hesitate to go through. But before you go through, notice the picture up here, the big three that made it all possible. Ford on the left-hand side, he furnished most of the money. Edison in the center, he furnished most of the brain power. And Firestone off on the right, he took the rubber from here up to Ohio and had it made into tires and other rubber goods products. Now, as you go down the aisle here, be sure you notice all of the glass items. For Mr. Edison had his own glass blower here, and all of the pipettes and the beakers were blowing right here in this lab. And when you get all the way to the end of the corridor, you're going around a little glass enclosed room that's dubbed the hay fever room, for that's where they shook the pollen out of the goldenrod before they started grinding the plant up in order to make rubber. So if you will turn to your right, go all the way down to the glass enclosed room, by the time you get there, I should be there to tell you what to look for on the way back. Up here on your left-hand side, you'll notice back here a bank of stills where they distill all the latex when they're making rubber. And on the floor by that still, there's a big glob of goldenrod rubber on the floor. That glob of goldenrod rubber has been there since 1931 when they closed this lab upon Mr. Edison's death. So this operated as a rubber research lab 1925 to 1931. As you come all the way around the corner here and start back up on this side, look up above and you'll notice we have one long drive shaft, one large electric motor up in the middle of the room. By belts, they come over to this drive shaft, and then by a series of belting and clutching, they take off the power, run all the equipment here in the lab off of that one electric motor. Edison had 12 to 15 people working with him. He'd go up to West Orange, New Jersey, and tell them how beautiful Florida was in the wintertime. They volunteered to come down, and as soon as they got here, he put them to work, and they worked all the time they were here. Now, as we go out to go across to the museum, be very careful when you first step step out the doorway here. One very short step when you step out. And then if you'll make 2 left turns and 2 right turns, you should end up in front of the green door that will allow us to go into the museum. But don't get too close to the green door, for I open it from the inside out. And if you're too close, I'll have a new ornament on the door. View after Eastman came out with a continuous emulsion film. You want to move up closer? Movies. So he went to work building cameras and projectors in order to use that continuous emulsion film. He was so optimistic that everything was going to work out all right, he built our first motion picture studio in West Orange, New Jersey. And he called that the Black Mariah. Now, we have a model of the Black Mariah here, for Mr. Edison made a few adjustments when he built it, for he soon realized there was not enough artificial light to expose the film. So he built the Black Mariah so you could open up the roof, and then the sun could shine right in on the stage, and you had plenty of light to expose that film. But you and I both know as the day progressed, pretty soon the sun would not be shining directly in. It would get way off on an angle. So Mr. Edison compensated for that by building the Black Mariah on a track. And then all of the actors and his stagehands would go out, and on a given signal, they'd all lean against the side of the building and turn the whole building around until they again had it lined up so they had plenty of light. So every few hours, all day long, you'd see them out pushing on the building, turning it around, following the sunshine. Now, it looks very simple when I do it here, but that building was 55 feet long, 25 feet wide, and almost 18 feet tall. Now, they tell me about 200 motion pictures were made here in the Black Mariah studio. Some of these were very short, but the very first motion picture of a man in motion was a man sneezing. And you know how long that takes. The first motion picture that involved 2 people was a kiss. No report whether it was long or short. First movie with a plot was a great train robbery. And you still can see the great train robbery if you go to Disney World in the theater on Main Street. Now, the first talkie was made in this studio. Mr. Edison was working on it with a couple of engineers, and he was called to Europe. So he went on to Europe, and they continued to work. So when he came back from Europe, they excitedly said, "Come out into the lab and watch this." He went out into the lab, they turned on a projector, it showed one of those engineers standing there, he tipped his hat and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Edison. How do you like your new invention?" And they had synchronized the motion picture with the phonograph so that they had our very first talkie movie. And I want our very first talkie movie, anybody remember what it was?
Jazz singer.
The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson. Generally that comes from an older person, but you'll do. Remember the date it was put out that well? Don't remember the date that well. I'll give him a little help on the date. Maybe you remember the year Lindbergh took the solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. 1927. Now another historical event happened that same year in the baseball field. Anybody remember that? The man with a big bat, Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. So now you'll never forget 1927. Babe Ruth, Lindbergh, the Jazz Singer, all 1927. Now I tell you, the simplest way now would be for us to move right across to the cars across the way, and then we'll not interfere with this group of students that's coming in behind us. Now the significance of the Cadillac here on the end, some of Mr. Edison's associates thought he ought to have an enclosed car for the cold New Jersey winters, and there was no automobile built with an enclosed body. But the electric car had an enclosed body, but the electric car would not run in the cold New Jersey winters. So they took the electric car body, they mounted it on a 1908 four-cylinder Cadillac chassis, and Mr. Edison had one of our first enclosed Cadillacs. Now you'd have thought he would have fallen in love with that car, but he fell in love with the Model T Ford. Now Ford worked for Edison as an engineer in the Detroit Edison Company, and he moonlit developing his car. Edison encouraged him all along the way. So when Ford came out with the first 3 prototypes of the Model T in 1907, he gave one of them to Mr. Edison. Edison fell in love with that car. Ford went on to success and said, "I'll give you a new car every year." And Edison said, "I don't want a new car. Happy with the one I have." Well, he was happy with it, but Ford wasn't. So every couple of years, Ford would send a mechanic down and they'd update Mr. Edison's car. So of the original 1907 car, we only have 3 component parts left. We still have the crank, we have the chassis, and we have the steering wheel. Everything else has been changed through the years. So we end up now with a 1914 body on the car. In 1922, they made the crank obsolete by adding an electric starter. 1925, they made the old carbide headlights obsolete by adding a nice electric headlight. Somewhere along the line, they came out with a speedometer that operates off of the wheel, and they added it. And in 1928, they took off the last of the old goldenrod rubber tires, and they put on the balloon tire of the day, which just happens to be a Firestone. Now, this is an operating car. It's driven in the Edison Parade of Lights each February here in Fort Myers. Now, if Father could have a mixture of a car, son Charles could have his own mixture. Now, son Charles was the most noted of the Edison children. He was Secretary of the Navy during the Roosevelt administration, and later he became governor of New Jersey. Now, Charles's car here is a Brewster car. The body of the Brewster car is all aluminum. The fenders are steel. It's mounted on an extended 1936 Ford chassis, and is powered by a flathead Ford V8 engine. So both father and son had mixtures of cars. Now, if you can remember back to when we were at the swimming pool, I said there was a fire in the barrel division of Mr. Edison's cement factory. Significance of the fire engine on the end is that's one of the types of fire engines that was used in battling that barrel division fire in Mr. Edison's cement factory up in New Village, New Jersey. Now, if we can go around to the end down here, and we'll talk about this generator right at the end here. Light bulbs are going to be interested in a total electric system. So again, Edison went to work to improve upon the dynamo of the day. Now, an Englishman by the name of Faraday invented the dynamo before Mr. Edison was born. But with all the improvements they were able to make on that, finally an American by the name of Wallace came up with a dynamo that got almost 41% efficiency. And Edison said, I think I can do better than that. So he built this contraption here and called this the long-waisted Mary Ann. Now, the long-waisted Mary Ann was a 3-wire system. When they hooked it up here with a steam engine, they got 90% efficiency. Edison was so happy with that, he took it all up to a little community of Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Now, he chose Sunbury because it's in the coal mining area. They were lighting their community with natural gas. And he wanted to prove that they could light it with electricity as cheap or cheaper than they'd been lighting it with gas. So he organized an electric light company, went into Sunbury, wired every house in the community, put out the street lights, and on July the 4th, 1883, Mr. Edison closed the switch that turned on that city of Sunbury, Pennsylvania. The very first community completely lighted with Edison incandescent lamps. He was so happy with that that when he came back to Fort Myers, he said, I'll sell that to the city fathers in Fort Myers. He went before our city council, and they turned him down. And there's a cartoon on the wall behind you there that depicts why they turned him down. They said if they had all of that light, it would disturb the cows, and they wouldn't give any milk. Now, to get all the way straight through, Mr. Edison made one invention that many of us wish he had not been so efficient at. And that was inventing a light meter to charge us for our electricity. He really didn't need to do such a good job of that. But he was charging 21 cents per kilowatt hour. And you go home and figure your bill at 21 cents, and I'm sure you'll say, we're not doing too badly nowadays. This large bulb here is a 50,000 watt bulb that was built on the 50th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb. Now, the 50,000 watt bulb was used commercially in the making of 3-dimensional films and for lighting a football field. On the 75th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb, they built this nice big 75,000 watt bulb. But it was never used commercially. It was strictly a demonstration bulb. Now, on the 100th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb, they decided not to build a bigger and better light bulb. They decided to use all of their money for radio and television advertising. And believe it or not, we haven't got a single thing we can show you for what they did on that 100th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb. But over on this side, we have a collection of Mr. Edison's early light bulbs. Now, Mr. Edison's first light bulb is not here. They took it apart to see why it wouldn't work. But we do have a model or a replica of it here in the dark base alongside of the sign. And that's how Mr. Edison's first light bulb actually looked. Now, on that same shelf, behind this picture, there's a little tiny piece of white paper. And on top of that little piece of white paper is the tiniest light bulb that was ever made. And that was used in children's medical equipment. So you can look there at the little tiny one, which had a use, back behind you at the large one, which really didn't have much use at all. Over on this side, we have some of the bamboo strips that were cut to make filaments for light bulbs. But the only bamboo bulbs we have are the two in the porcelain base at this end of this case. Edison was the inventor of the fluoroscope. But he never took a patent out on the fluoroscope. He said that's good for medical science, so he never patented the fluoroscope. Now the question was asked, where did Mr. Edison get the money to do all of this? And the thing that put Mr. Edison in business was his universal stock printer. Now when he was working on the universal stock printer, he put a figure in the back of his mind. And he said, if I can sell this invention for $5,000, I'm going to be very happy. He finally had the opportunity of going before the stock board and making a presentation. As he made that presentation, he must have lost his nerve. For he didn't end up by saying, I would like $5,000 for this invention. He ended up by saying, how much will you give me for it? And then he had to wait for them to make up their minds. And it took them a little while. But finally they came around and they said, Mr. Edison, would you seriously consider taking $40,000 for this invention? And Edison almost fainted right there on the spot. But he did regain enough composure to sign the contract. And as he was signing the contract, he kind of chuckled to himself. And they said, what in the world are you laughing at? He said, if you had been smart businessmen, you could have bought this invention for only $5,000. And their immediate response was, if you had been sharp, you should have held out for a little bit more. For we were really authorized to go to $60,000. So he lost a few $1,000s. But at age 23, he took his first $40,000, bought his first factory, went into the production of telegraph equipment and universal stock printers. And you will hear all kinds of stories that Mr. Edison was a very poor businessman. But he didn't do too badly. For upon his death in 1931, his estate was valued between $14 and $16 million. So that 40,000 did grow through the years. Now, so you will have a reason to come back and visit us again. They're building a large addition onto the museum. No opening date has been set, but keep in touch and maybe you can visit us in the new addition. Edison gets his name here on a sewing machine. Not that he had a thing to do with the invention of the sewing machine, but he did put a universal electric motor on it, one that would run on either AC or DC current. And then you'll come by some of his goldenrod rubber products here, and it won't take you long to ascertain that he was a very poor maker of hot water bottles. The office here at the end of the corridor is Charles Edison's office. Now, I would mention that Charles was the most noted of the Edison children. Charles also was like his daddy in the fact that he didn't need too much sleep. So he collected owls to show that he belonged to that great fraternity of night owls. And you'll see many varieties of owls back there in Charles's office. This is a picture of Charles and his wife when he was governor of New Jersey. The next picture is Charles and Mrs. Edison in 1947 when she donated the property to the city of Fort Myers. And then as you come down the aisle, we do have a little picture of Mr. Edison here. It's really not his best view, but it does show that he curled up and took those naps on his bench. And then the living room on the right-hand side is from the Charles Edison estate again, and the interesting thing there are the portraits of the second Mrs. Edison and Thomas, and that's Charles over the piano. You might notice the violin in the front of the room does not have the usual chin rest on it. Mr. Edison took the chin rest off so he could pick up the vibrations directly from the sounding board. Now the dishes on each side of the archway here are from the Charles Edison estate again, and they tell me they're all hand-painted. So you may want to come back and look at them a little more in detail. But we're going right around the corner here and talk about a little doll we have in the case around the corner here. Edison was the inventor of the talking doll. And when he first pushed the talking doll on the market, it was a complete failure. And he couldn't figure out for the life of him why people wouldn't be interested in that beautiful little talking doll. And it took them a long time to come up with an answer that to us would have seemed so obvious. For all dolls were these beautiful little talking dolls, girl dolls. And the little girl doll, the voice that was recorded to go in that was recorded in the factory where only men worked. So the men were recording the voice they put in that beautiful little talking doll. Well, it took them a little while to figure out what the trouble was, but then they figured that out. They retooled, they put a nice feminine voice in the doll, and then they had immediate success. For then they were able to sell 12,000 talking dolls at $35 each. And $35 at that time was 1 month's wages for a telegraph operator. Now, I would think one of Mr. Edison's most rewarding experiences was the invention of the phonograph. Now, he drew up the plans for the phonograph, gave it to an engineer. They came out with this little machine that we have a model of here. And on December the 6th, 1877, Mr. Edison sat down in front of that little machine, turned the crank, and recited, "Mary Had a Little Lamb." He then turned it back and started it over, and much to his surprise, out came "Mary Had a Little Lamb," the first recording of the human voice. And they say that is the one and only invention that Mr. Edison ever had that it worked the very first time he tried it. Now, I did mention the doghouse on the other side. And the reason we think Mrs. Edison could put him in that doghouse was she loved to sew. And one day she wanted to do some sewing, and her sewing machine was missing. It took her quite a while. She finally went over to his lab, and sure enough, there was her sewing machine. And he had taken the sewing head off, he had mounted one of his phonographs, and for the very first time, instead of sitting and turning that disc by hand, he had treadle power as far as turning the disc is concerned. But we're convinced she couldn't do too much sewing on that old phonograph, so she had good reason to put him up in the doghouse. Now, he was the inventor of the machine you put your money in to listen to the record of the day. And his first machine was a nice penny machine, but it was a failure, for he made no provision for changing the record. But that led to the invention of the Nickelodeon. And the advantage of the Nickelodeon was once you put your nickel in, you had 24 different selections to choose from. As you come down the aisle, notice the phonograph here with a water hose connected to it. That was for people who had running water in their homes. Hook up the hose to the faucet, turn on the faucet, and the water pressure would run the phonograph. He was ahead of us as far as stereophonic sound. A two-horn speaker, one to pick up the low notes and one to pick up the high notes. Now, if the phonograph was questioned...
Does the Nickelodeon still work?
Really don't know. It's not been played since I've been here. We did have one up here that was played, but they broke it about a month ago, so it's still into being repaired. So actually we have nothing now that we really can demonstrate to you. But if the phonograph was one of his most rewarding experiences, one of his most frustrating experiences must have been the work he did in improving the battery of his day. Now, they were doing experimentation to improve that battery. They had done 9,000 experiments, and they were all failures. His staff began to rebel and say, let's go on and do something more important. But Edison said, well, now all you know is 9,000 ways not to do that. You still don't know how to do it. So he put them back to work, and they did an additional 41,000 experiments, a total of 50,000 experiments over a 10-year period before he would put his stamp of approval upon a carbon nickel alkali battery. But it was such an efficient battery, they could make a very small one, and a miner could actually carry that battery on a belt around his waist. So because of the efficiency of Edison batteries, he helped introduce safety into mining at that time. Now, this industrial machine on the left-hand side here was given to us by the Corrugated Box Company of Elgin, Illinois. It was driven in under its own power with Edison carbon nickel alkali batteries that are over 50 years of age. So when he built them, he really built them to last. Now, I'd like to close with just one final statement about Mr. Edison. Edison and Ford were visiting the Burbanks in California. And the Burbanks had a guest register, and on their guest register, they asked 3 questions: your name, your occupation, and what you're interested in. Mr. Edison signed it, Thomas A. Edison, inventor, interested in everything. And I think that pretty well sums up the man we've been talking about. Now, do feel free to look around the museum. The only thing we ask is that you not interfere too much with the other tours when they come through. When you are ready to leave, if you'll leave through the archway, that'll take you back out to the gift shop and to the parking area. You've been a very attentive and responsive group. It's been my pleasure to have you, and I do want to thank you for coming and visiting Thomas Edison's Winter Home. Thank you very much. Thank you.